Okay, I'm ready.
All right, guess I'm ready too. Hi, I'm the Logos of Self-Aggrandizement Sheep, and this is my diva, I mean coder, Cheese.
Excuse me, I'm an idol.
Well, we're going to be ending the podcast right here, right now. We're going to be retiring this podcast, and we're really only going to return for it for things like interviews. So, people like the fan translators, Jeff Embray, Numinous, anyone who worked with Mikage. But for the most part, I think we're done with the experimental side of the podcast. And I'm pretty sure you're going to be asking, wait, why? I mean, since episode 1, you've wanted to do this, sheep. And honestly, it's always been about experimentation. And now that I think I've proven myself with Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia, I think these are just redundant now. As much as I like to hear the sound of my own voice and as much as I love to have cheese on, it really just eats into my time and it really doesn't produce anything of value. So I'd like to have that for more things like pushing out the videos a lot faster and things like meme videos when I can. I think right now, Cheese, what do you think about just killing the podcast right here and right now?
I mean, not ending the literal recording here, right here and now, but yeah, I think the whole point of the podcast originally was sort of progress updates on learning how to produce videos, and at this point, you've found a style that works for you. You have sort of a production system worked out for yourself that works for you. I know it might take a little bit of time, but hey, not everybody has to be pumping out a 20-minute long video every 3 days. So I think it's fine to kill the podcast at this point and use it for more special occasions. And you can use the podcast format now to get yourself into, like you said, more interview type stuff, more audio content that lends itself to something productive.
I think the same way as well. It's really just here if we need it, but I think at this point we can take the training wheels off. Moving forward as well, I think we can also just reframe our expectations just as a channel. I think now that I've begun to watch more and more different channels, I'm really thinking that I have this one shtick and that's all I'm going to be. And as a result, I'm not going to have that many subscribers, and I'm completely fine with that. I already have a full-time job. Both Cheese and I have pretty good jobs that we at least nominally like. And I don't think that chasing that lowest common denominator, as most YouTubers do, is not something that I want to do, and I don't want to saturate my own content with stuff like that. So realistically, I think I'm just going to have 2,000 subscribers by the time we get to VFD, or 7th Dragon 3 VFD. But I do still want to have enough of a draw that by the time we hit 7th Dragon 2020, which is I want to say 7 videos from now, I want at least 777 subscribers just because of the meme. But I think the ultimate goal, if 2,000 is the realistic goal, I want to shoot for the moon and hit 7,777, once again hitting that 7 meme. I think I just have to be real at this point in time. We're going to say small. I'm a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. Basically, the people who watch gaming YouTubers, the people who watch JRPGs is an even smaller niche. The people who watch JRPGs and can speak Japanese or at least have some amount of bilinguality as an even smaller niche. And the people who like Imageepoch are an extremely small niche. So that's really why you're here. You're not really looking at my videos for a recommendation. You're really here to join me on an extended post-mortem of Imageepoch. That being said, if once this video series does end, I think I'm just gonna be kind of just in the background supporter, like just filling things out in Moby games, or giving out the downloads for all of the soundtracks that I have on KH Insider. Because once I make my story, I've pretty much just made my story, and maybe I'll just come back for a couple of videos left and right. The point is that I kind of want to have this archiving focused review series, and you're just kind of along for the ride with my own wacky madness. The only two videos that I really wanted to prove myself were Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia. And now that I've done those, I think I can safely say I can move on to the next chapter and just keep going, knowing that this is all going to have a finite end. So, Cheese, honestly, what are your thoughts on this? And do you think we're actually ready to say goodbye to the podcast after all of this with this change in expectations?
Like I said previously, I think it's perfectly fine because the podcast was mainly for training wheels. And if you take a look at all the games that you have yet to review in the series, let's count them. That's 4, 7, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21 more games, basically. I think you're set for a long time. I think it might sound like an end to the channel somewhat by killing the podcast, but given your production schedule, I think this is going to go on for a long time, longer than I think you even imagine it.
But we're losing the soul.
I mean, that's part of the journey, isn't it? If you're following along Imageepoch, you're losing soul.
Yeah. I mean, when we get into Luminous Arc 3, the next episode, that whole idea of losing what you think you are and maintaining what you think you are is actually going to be the battle that Imageepoch has with its own identity for the entire review series. So I think we're just ripping off the Band-Aid now, and I am preemptively showing you what happens when I basically emulate the entirety of Imageepoch's life with my own review series. I think that's a lot of, fart sniffing, but I think the only way to understand what is going on with Imageepoch with so little information connecting you from point A to point B is to just project your own shortcomings in your life and your own interpretation of things, because no one is legitimately willing to give you an answer. There is another YouTuber, Overworked Salaryman. He basically did a deep dive into Imageepoch and how it failed, and he straight up knows enough Japanese to reach out to people like Kazuya Nino and say, hey, look, I want to interview you. And he got nothing from them. So not even a, hey, look, I'm busy, don't bother me. He just straight up got nothing. I think that is enough confirmation that nobody wants to talk about this, and you're just going to be stuck filling in the gaps because your mind needs to fill in the gaps. I think that being said, we're still going to have references to the podcast, right? The demotivational posters are just an Easter egg at this point. If you know what that is, congratulations, you're part of the secret club, but that's literally it. I think moving on and just kind of growing out of this podcast, I do have a blue sky now. This was completely of my own doing. I know that for a very long time, I was very difficult to reach, but now I do have a business email that you can email me on my YouTube channel. The blue sky is literally just there for my memes. Like, it is a joke within the people that know me that I have no sense of taste, and I will mix any disparate amount of drinks and make them like one cursed like mimosa. You're basically just going to see that on my blue sky. You might not see furry porn. Okay, not that much furry porn. It's literally just my old Tumblr page from high school. Of course, there's a coffee if you want to support myself and Cheese. Please do not support me if you cannot support yourself. I'm literally just doing this for a joke, and I'm literally just doing it because I think that's what Mikage would do. Do not support me if you cannot support yourself, please. That being said, I think it would be really, really, really funny if I went the entire review series without a single dollar donated to me, so I think I'm doing great so far. Also, in the meantime, you can see me in some comment sections on some of my favorite YouTubers. A handful of them include Marsh, who does a lot of like deep dives into Japan-only games, and Shin Megami Tensei. Tolgain, he used to do MapleStory stuff, but now he's doing like slightly long-form video essays. He just did one on Voices of the Void and Mizurna Falls, and I think they're great. Gnosis, this guy also does JRPGs, specifically JRPGs that are in Japan. Are you noticing a trend yet? And Overworked Salaryman, who is a game developer in Japan and just has this hodgepodge of stuff. Most recently, defending a Kuso game, a game from the Rosen Maiden anime. That's kind of where I like to be in this like super super small niche. That's pretty much where my influences are coming from now that I know what I am. Like I'm not trying to emulate a big YouTube reviewer like Mandalore or Seth. Like I know what I do, and that's pretty much the end of that. So, geez, any other thoughts before we wrap up this section?
No, I think you covered it pretty good. Although you slipped something in there that you thought it would be funny if nobody donated to you ever, and I'm gonna take that as a challenge.
Okay, good. I thought you were gonna donate right now. Like, no,
Don't tempt me.
no. Let's just rip off the band-aid and let's close out this final podcast with going over Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia. Both Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise were both written with the intent that I'd make a podcast. And I still think that it's bad form if I don't close them out as intended. Let's just begin now. And Cheese, how did you think Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia came out when it came to the review?
Between the two of them, because Seventh Dragon was an earlier video of yours and you were still learning, I do think Arc Rise came out as a better video, despite its certainly more confusing content. I think you explained it sufficiently well enough. I did have to go through the video 2 or 3 times prior to this podcast just to make sure that I understood the core plot of the game in my head, but it made sense. Compared to Seventh Dragon's much more simplistic plot, I could still figure it all out, and the production quality of Arc Rise was better all around, so that one wins for me.
Yeah, I think talking about like how things were different between those videos, that is something I still want to maintain because every Imageepoch game is drastically different from one another. But I think now there is more responsibility on me to properly explain everything and not just make the story segment just this whole 20-minute stand-up comedy session. I think with Seventh Dragon, I experimented with that by just having no text. Funnily enough, that did confuse a lot of the weebs, but everyone else who got it 100% got it. With Arc Rise Fantasia specifically, I did really veer into just making fun of it for the sake of making fun of it. We did discuss how a few of the finer details actually got lost, which is something I can no longer do. I don't have the podcast to basically say, yeah, I fucked up the story, save me podcast. So I now have to actually properly explain it while still doing that rapid fire joke bit. And let's just talk about Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia. They're two completely different games, but the level of quality between Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia is noticeably different. And just starting off right now with your impressions, Cheese, why do you think Seventh Dragon ended up the way it did and having a following the way it did, while Arc Rise Fantasia has, that kind of following?
So there's twofold. One, it's visuals. Seventh Dragon has a very distinctive art style, very colorful, contrasty. Arc Rise is kind of flat. It's what you'd expect for a game of its era on the Wii. I don't see its art style holding on that much. And then twofold, it's the localization. So Seventh Dragon didn't really have one, and Arc Rise did, and it was botched to the point that most people remember it because of the botched localization and the horrible voice acting. So Seventh Dragon has a following because of all its positive qualities, and Arc Rise has a following because of all its negative qualities. Not like purely because there's obviously something to pull out of it still, but that's where the core of the difference lies in my eyes.
Yeah, and I think if you want to use just my comment section as a sample, right? If you look in Seventh Dragon, those comments are basically like, yeah, this is an amazing game. Kazuya Nino is holding Imageepoch on its back. It's always just positive and that's it. If you go into Arc Rise Fantasia, the first thing you'll typically see is, yeah, this game sucks, but X, Y, and Z. And there's always some sort of like, they have to justify why they like Arc Rise Fantasia, which I'm not trying to say Arc Rise Fantasia is a bad game and you can't like it. It's more of this is how much you have to go out of your way to explain away the bad localization, sometimes an over convoluted plot, and things like that, where it's very, very hard to sell to the layperson, like play this game instead of Seventh Dragon. This is just a really good game. You might not like it if you don't like these brutal dungeon crawlers, but you'll kind of just like everything else. So if we go past these impressions of just playing the game, let's actually talk about the history and staff, my favorite section. And I'm just going to open up with Seventh Dragon and just tell you that out of the 100 credited roles, 14 roles were outsourced. The people who made Seventh Dragon didn't actually have an actual stake in Imageepoch. So if we look at the story of all things, that was outsourced to Scenario Kobo Gekko by this guy named Kei Shigema. Kei Shigema wrote Lunar 1 and Lunar 2. And if you don't know what those games are, it is generally considered to be like one of the comfy JRPGs. The localization was very contested, but a lot of people do remember Lunar just being this fun game, but was just an enjoyable story through and through. He also wrote Castlevania Order of Ecclesia, so that is one of the best, if not the best, Castlevania on the DS. It has my main man Barlow, which was an amazing villain. So that is the power of the writing from Scenario Kobo Gekko. You also have Ashura's Wrath. Geez, you might not know this one, but it's the one where it's like basically a Machamp punching God in the face. It's literally one man raging against the heavens, and it's an amazing story. And most recently, they did Scarlet Nexus. So, geez, we have a mutual friend who played Scarlet Nexus, and he absolutely loved it. But that is the power of Scenario Kobo Gekko. With the sound in particular, you have another company, Ancient Corp, and they have their whole like list of games that they make on their own. But the sound design was outsourced by Takeshi Arai, who did the sound effects to Etrian Odyssey. Once again, proving that Etrian Odyssey is very closely related to Seventh Dragon. And even in production design, you have this company called Pixel Pocket. You have Yusuke Sakairi, who would then go on to work on Black Rock Shooter the Game, which is a few games out into our series. And you also have Yoshimi Nakamura, who worked on Xenosaga Episode 3. Artwork was done by a company named Kusanagi. There are 3 PR companies. The web design was also outsourced. And in particular, there are a handful of standouts that I do want to point out. In map design, you have Ayumi Ino, who worked on the map design in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus. You also have Masahiro Tori, who is a core Imageepoch employee who worked on the Luminous Arc games. In planning, you might know this one, Cheese. Do you know Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers?
You fucking know it.
What if I told you that in the planning for 7th Dragon, Natsuko Ishikawa, the writer for Final Fantasy Shadowbringers, this is her first ever credited role.
Oh, that's impressive.
This is the kind of power they have from 7th Dragon. Not only that, you have Dai Oba in planning, who would eventually direct Stellar Glow, basically the Imageepoch game that everybody talks about. In the pixel art section, you have Tomoki Oda, who worked on Luminous Arc and was the main designer in Luminous Arc. And then you have a few people that only ever worked on Stand of Destruction and 7th Dragon. That's Masatoshi Aizumi and Hiroyuki Goto. For those two in particular, that was their only ever credited role in a video game on Moby Games. So I don't know what happened to these people, but just stop and think about that if that is true. That experience was so negative for them that they just straight up jumped the games industry. Maybe they're just in Japanese only games, and Moby Games is, of course, American centric. So I'm hoping that's not the case, but if that is true, that is a very harrowing message for the creative side of Imageepoch. In Arc Rise, I did talk about this in the video, but the team is primarily from Tales of games. You have battle design Osamu Hisano, who is the lead game design for Tales of Arise, the most recent Tales of game, but was also the battle programmer for Tales of Symphonia. The lead programmer was Takashi Kawamoto, who worked on Princess Crown, which is an old Sega Genesis game. And then you have a lot of overlap from the leadership side of Seventh Dragon working smaller roles on Arc Rise. Basically, Daioba, again, is there for level planning. Kanemaru is the supervisor. Mikage is obviously the producer. And then you have Inukai, the lead visual effects designer. And of course, any mention of Arc Rise is not complete without any mention of Ignition. So let's talk about the localization team for a minute. We know that the localization team was basically given the budget of a Happy Meal, but you do actually have some pretty substantial talent. The localization manager, Wako Yokoyama, worked on Bravely Default, which is a fantastic localization when it came to America. Also for Octopath Traveler 1 and 2, and even more recently, Triangle Strategy, all of which have very good localization and just incredible direction from voicing, and it just made it an incredibly good product to play stateside. Even the localization specialist, Tetsuhiro Akiyama, worked on Stray Blade and Miasma Chronicles, and those are very small games, but both games released in 2023. So despite the negative reputation of Arc Rise, this guy is still finding work. But most notably, the product coordinator, Atsumi Hirano, her last credited role was El Shaddai Ascension of the Metatron, which would have come out about a year later, and she's just off the map. I don't know what happened to her, but I just hope she's doing well to this day. Now that we've talked about just the staff and how most of Seventh Dragon was actually outsourced, geez, does this change your thoughts on the reception of Seventh Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia at all?
If anything, it lets me know that there was a lot more thought put into Seventh Dragon as a whole, because in order to manage external teams, you have to put in a lot more effort to get a good result. Whereas in Arc Rise, what I noted when you were writing some stuff down was in battle design, Osamu Hisano, the battle programmer for Tales of Symphonia, and you bring up Tales of Symphonia as a big reference point in the video. It seems like at that point they had moved on to just, we want to make a game of this style based on this other game. So we're just going to take the people that worked on that other game and do it again in our own way, which seems a bit disingenuous in terms of creativity, because you just want to keep making the same thing again, but your way. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. It seems like they were more cohesive when they were outsourcing stuff, but that's maybe because they were more of a fresh company, whereas later on now they're starting to realize, oh, we need to make money, we have employees, we can't just spend a whole ton of time reworking everything.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. Because they basically worked, and because Mikage's origins came from Tales of Symphonia, he was probably having these dreams of, I'm going to make my own company, I'm going to do my own thing. I guess he held on to that, which is admirable in of itself, but when it came to Arc Rise Fantasia, it was basically Mikage screaming, I'm going to make my own Tales of Symphonia with hookers and blackjack. And it kind of showed when it came to how the battle system worked, like the small details I showed in the video. Things like story beats were almost a one-to-one copy, and at that point, what are you doing? Like, what is original, and what exactly are you trying to prove when you make a product that you are trying to sell to the market in general. I think the biggest concern with this section, which is again my favorite section, this is very narrative driven and it's also very speculative. Geez, I'm really worried about how we're going to take this part of the podcast and put it into the video. So, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, and I'm thinking something like a Google Sheet to sort of track between the games and the different people, at least notable people. You don't want to track the entirety of credits because a lot of people will show up only one time. That might be a good way of noting down where people were coming from, or just a trimmed down version in the video to sort of display these people were coming from these games and carrying it across, or something of that sort. I think would work well without having to have this whole section in the video and just more pictorially.
Yeah, I think for that, I do want to have a few standouts, like things like the writing team, probably like pixel art or UI. I know a handful of people who worked in Imageepoch kind of stayed until the end, and some of them are Junichi Watari. So I do want to keep a focus on them, but at the same time, maybe smaller things like, but maybe the like one-off employees like Masatoshi Azumi and Hiroyuki Goto. Like I can say, if you want a full list, take a look at this Excel spreadsheet because we have a lot of sources now, and I'll just say this is just further reading if you want to take a look at that. So I think moving forward for Luminous Arc 3, I do want to talk about the core team, like the writer, the director, producer, things like that, and kind of just random highlights that I think are interesting. I'll put into an Excel file that has an entire employee manifest moving forward. So I think now that we are comfortable with how to move the history and staff into the video, let's talk about the sales of 7th Dragon and Arc Rise Fantasia. 7th Dragon kind of made gangbusters on its release because it was the number 2 game that sold upon release. And the number 1 seller was Resident Evil 5. The number 3 seller was Dynasty Warriors, which is also a huge series. But that is the point that I'm trying to make. Despite very huge game series that 7th Dragon was fighting against, it was still popular. It was so popular to the point that it got a re-release, kind of like a greatest hits on your PlayStation. Basically, there was so much demand for 7th Dragon that they had to re-release it and make it even cheaper by like removing things like the manual, and that is incredible for Imageepoch in general. Kazuya Nino went on record in a 7th Dragon podcast that he was hosting to hype up the game, and he said, "If I can sell 250,000 copies, I think we'd be golden." And he kept repeating that for a handful of the podcast episodes, and if I recall correctly, that's about 5 episodes out of a 15-episode podcast series. And he got pretty close. The end of the year sales for 7th Dragon was 145,000. So that's pretty incredible because Arc Rise Fantasia barely hit 50,000 sales in Japan in 1 year. It basically went on the recommended games, a kind of re-release, but that was really only to sell more copies out of desperation. Silicon Era even made note of this and said, "It's weird that Arc Rise Fantasia, the game itself, is selling for $10 cheaper than the Arc Rise Fantasia soundtrack." And everyone just thought it was funny, but at this point the damage was done. It was so bad to the point that it's not just Arc Rise Fantasia's fault, but also games like Muramasa the Demon Blade, which is something I mentioned in the other video, and also just an incredibly good Vanillaware game. Those games on the Wii sold so poorly that the president of Marvelous Entertainment himself, Yasuhiro Wada, went on this like unhinged rant on a company blog. The whole point of the blog was that these games on the Wii aren't selling, and it wasn't really clear if he was pointing a finger at himself or if he was blaming the Wii. But it got so bad that he had to go on another interview in America on this magazine called Edge. And he said, no, I'm basically trying to say that Marvelous Entertainment is a small company and we're not big enough to compete against the big boys. But it really did sound like he was whining at something, and you were just never really clear what it was because he was always changing, always shifting the point of blame to something else. I guess now that you know just the sheer sales numbers, geez, why do you think Seventh Dragon ended up the way it did? And why did Arc Rise Fantasia end up the way it did, at least in Japan?
So what I had brought up previous in the podcast still applies, right? Seventh Dragon is a more visually stunning game than Arc Rise, and a lot of video games sell on promotional materials, and Seventh Dragon probably has better promotional material, if I'm being perfectly honest here. The second thing, though, is between the DS games and Wii games, sure, there are more DS games, but the quality of them as time went on got better. Whereas for the Wii, by the time higher quality Wii games were coming out, the bar was really, really high. Like you had to have an extremely good game, extremely good visuals, at least for the time, right? This was back in the early 2000s. But you could also sort of see this trend starting where the console games market started trending towards more complex games, better graphics, better story for a higher price tag. You know, hindsight being 2020, at this point, you will realize that indie games are a big thing. And I think that was around the time that this sort of change started to happen, where people were becoming less and less enthused with pricey games that weren't of high quality.
Yeah, you're exactly right. In America, that would be the time of Fez, I think. And that would be the time of this other game called Limbo. I mean, in the indie scene, yeah, there's definitely a shift. I think you also bring up a really good point of marketing. Seventh Dragon knew who they were marketing to. Like I mentioned in that review, Seventh Dragon is really for the people who like dungeon crawlers and who are dungeon crawler adjacent, so people like Final Fantasy. Nino went on his podcast straight up saying, look, I wanted to make a game that I wanted to play, and that absolutely showed. The problem is that someone higher up, probably Mikage, probably Mizutani, but somebody very high up in Imageepoch does not understand this. It starts as early as Sands of Destruction, which we both watched the anime, and we both came to the conclusion that the Sands of Destruction anime is basically just a commercial. Problem is that is supposed to be a commercial for kids. That was supposed to be the way to get that market. The agreement that the Sands of Destruction anime group was that their show would air at midnight or around 1 a.m. No kid is going to be awake at that time. It's just confusing, and it gets even worse when you think of the tie-in materials. The manga is extremely ultra-violent. It is to the point where there is a handful of panels where Morte firebombs a city and a human walks out of that rubble on fire. So why did Mikage freak out? Why did the manga get that gory? And why did the anime just be this commercial for kids? It doesn't make sense, and it seems like there is a misunderstanding of how to market a game that is 100% Imageepoch. And then this gets worse with Arc Rise. Arc Rise's reception was so divisive that Mizutani on the Arc Rise Fantasia website wrote a blog post. Hey, look, I looked at a lot of the online reviews for Arc Rise Fantasia, and it kind of fucked me up. Like, he basically said, I think there were a lot of things that I did well with, but there are also a lot of things I did really poorly in. And I think from Arc Rise Fantasia, I just have to do better. Yes, that seems like a very positive message, but there is this feeling of defeat in the way he wrote. You know, that mindset kind of really messed with him. Because if we go into Luminous Arc 3 and Stellar Glow, it does feel like there is a sense of resentment that Arc Rise Fantasia didn't do as well as Seventh Dragon or just do as well as his expectations. When it comes to the merchandise, again, Cheese, you hit it right on the money. There was a huge advertising campaign for Seventh Dragon, and I think that really affected it. Cheese, we're both familiar with the image sharing site Pixiv. The interesting thing about Seventh Dragon was that they had their advertisement campaign when Pixiv was barely 2 years old, right? You're basically having DeviantArt in its infancy taking a huge amount of money and saying, here's Seventh Dragon. And that burgeoning community, and even compounding with just how well the visuals are and just how animated even some of the sprites are, that really helped push out Seventh Dragon to a wider audience, because now you have a huge amount of fan art, cosplay, things like models. So it basically almost turns like Toho, where it's just this gigantic fan following, and even got to the point that we have gacha figurines. Like, you have my gacha figurine of the warrior, the cat with pink hair.
Yep.
And I have the mage, the one with white hair. That's gigantic. No Imageepoch game was that popular that a toy company said, hey, we want to make gacha figurines from your characters. Meanwhile, Arc Rise barely had their pre-order bonus. Fans had to scream at Yasunori Mitsuda to release the official soundtrack. And that's pretty much it. When it comes to fan art and stuff like that, there's not that much of Arc Rise Fantasia. So this also brings me up to another point. Cheese, we're both big consumers of anime and anime accessories. What do you think about using supplementary material like this and fan works like this to gauge popularity?
It's really just a health meter of how people are enjoying the stuff that a company is putting out. So in this case, the Arc universe fandom, I guess I'll call it, at least in comparison to Seventh Dragon, where Seventh Dragon, you have a bunch of fairly unique looking characters, fairly unique looking sprites, so you can make cool merch and make good fan material out of it. If I'm being perfectly honest, looking at Arc Rise, I don't see a lot of characters that I would necessarily be drawn to, right? Like, Lark is a pretty generic main character. Riffy is kind of whatever. Surge seemed somewhat interesting, but only if you slog through the story to get through all of his twists and turns. And then all of the other sort of more interesting characters, so like Issa, Real, Imaginal, all of those are hidden quite far behind, and you wouldn't want to be producing material of them up front because they're sort of meant to be a capstone on the plot. So there wasn't a lot to really work with up front unless you wanted to slog through it and get to a point that you could make something from it as a fan work. Whereas Seventh Dragon, you sort of jump in and you can just make stuff. So yeah, fan works are definitely a way of judging how well your thing is doing. And Arc Rise clearly didn't do too good, and that's a bit unfortunate.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things for Seventh Dragon is that in a lot of the fan works, it's just the artist's interpretation of their party doing wacky things. One of the comics that was officially released by Sega is basically a Seventh Dragon party just doing their own thing. And that is Nino's design philosophy. He says, look, I don't really care about the grand story as a whole, but what I care about is what you think they're doing. And that absolutely showed, and creative fans will be creative fans, and they will fill in the gaps for you. They will sell the product for you. So I guess now is a really good time to talk about the story. Cheese, I know this was some really good feedback you gave to me when I originally released the Seventh Dragon review. I didn't really talk about the story in the English language. You basically had to pick up the pieces, and this is a point that I'm trying to make because I will explain Seventh Dragon's story in about 5 minutes. I'm going to have a stopwatch on my phone, and I'm going to explain it right now without going motor mouth. Starting now. Okay, basically, in Seventh Dragon, the dragons show up out of nowhere, and it's up to you to fight the dragons. You magically defeat the dragons, but you end up in a coma for 3 years. This is probably because of exhaustion, but no one really knows for sure. During those 3 years, dragons take over the world, and all of the most populous cities are basically cornered by the dragons. When you wake up from your coma, it is now your mission to reunite the world, but everybody is against each other. You start off with Aizen, which doesn't really want anyone's help, but you do get societies like the Nevin Place people who are willing to help you, and the scholar city of Pleroma who know quite a bit about the dragons. Pleroma in particular is led by someone named Emil. But as the game goes on and as you defeat more and more dragons, you realize that Emil brainwashed the Nevin Place people to basically create something called a soul cannon, where when one of the 7 true dragons, Niara, shows up, Emil commands almost all of the Nevin Place people, basically the Roosh, who are the cat girls or the elf-looking guys. They basically go into the soul cannon, sacrifice themselves into a single beam of light to kill Niara. It does not work. So now the party needs to go to an ancient civilization called Tokyon, where Emil and her sister Takehaya, or where Emil and her sister Itel basically helped Tokyon save the world from dragons. The problem is that Emil conducted human experimentation on someone named Takehaya. Takehaya is the hybrid of dragon DNA and human DNA, and by this point in the game, Takehaya has gone crazy, and he's basically mostly dragon. We kill Takehaya and get something called the Dragon Chronicle, which unlocks something called the Dragon Slayer. We use the Dragon Slayer to beat Niara, and all the dragons are gone. At least we think, because Niara is the 3rd true dragon of the 7 true dragons, and in post-game, we end up fighting a true dragon named Broodmother. If you have played any of the 7th Dragon games, this is very important because it's basically telling us that the dragon threat has not been eliminated. That is 7th Dragon in 2 minutes and 50 seconds. There are some interesting details with Niara. His head looks like an orchid, and orchids are something called frontier species. So in biology, think about an arid desert, or even think about a beach, right? Those are very, very difficult places for plants to grow. But orchids in particular are very, very hardy species that can thrive in these crazy conditions. So that's a really interesting detail with Niara. And the life cycle of dragons themselves are more like jellyfish or mushrooms, where they have a seed, they germinate into some body, and they mature into this big dragon, and then revert to the cycle of seed, flower or bloom, dragon, seed, etc., etc. I think someone also pointed this out when I was reviewing it, but it's basically a JRPG War of the Worlds. There's red weed, which is the bloom, which basically chokes off most of the life on our planet. There's general human incompetence, as we see with Emil, and dragons are only defeated by some sort of natural defense. Basically, our own genetic makeup lets us fight the dragons. In terms of certain connections to religion, Takehaya is named after Takehaya Susanoo, an ancient Japanese god who was the god of storms, sea, and agriculture. He's also extremely volatile, but it depends on who wrote the story. Takehaya is the younger brother of the sun god Amaterasu, which is the ancestress of the Japanese imperial line. Takehaya is notable for killing this monster called Yamata no Orochi, an 8-headed dragon, and Takehaya was also banished from heaven because of his destructive nature. Kind of similar to how Takehaya was trapped in Tokyon and was basically meant to defeat dragons. On the story of defeating Yamata no Orochi, Takahaya runs into an elderly couple where 7 of 8 daughters had been eaten. They hid their 8th daughter by transforming her into a comb, and basically falls in love with the 8th daughter and asks for her hand in marriage if Takahaya defeats Orochi. Takahaya defeats the dragon by being crafty. He basically makes the dragon drink sake and killed it while it was drunk. Takahaya found this sword called Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the sword of the gathering clouds of heaven, but also known as Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword. So if anyone has played 7th Dragon 2020, Murakumo is going to be very familiar, and you'll find out why soon. So after Takahaya beats Orochi, Takahaya presents the sword to Amaterasu as a apology gift. Basically, Amaterasu accepts the gift, Takahaya goes back to heaven, and Amaterasu bestows the sword to the first emperor of Japan. And that forms one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan. Basically, that is the proof of royalty if you are a Japanese emperor, and nobody has ever seen it. So you can tell there's a lot of parallels with 7th Dragon and the story of Yamato no Orochi, but that is really it when it comes to religion in 7th Dragon. There's no, let me make this religion of Buddhism versus Catholicism. Let me tear down everything about those religions and everything I don't like. Let me talk about Gnosticism and how I think God is just an idiot. There is nothing like that in 7th Dragon. It's literally just a single reference to a god because a character's name is Takahaya. In terms of story cheese, because I went in depth in the story and analyzed the story in Arc Rise, and I just don't want to repeat myself. So if anyone is watching and if anybody wants to make this comparison themselves, I recommend just watching the video. Now that we have a better understanding of what 7th Dragon's story is versus Arc Rise's story, who do you think did the story better?
Ooh, hard question, because 7th Dragon's story is much more succinct and compact versus Arc Rise's tangled mess of a story. I think 7th Dragon did it better. I much prefer if things are just strictly referential, whereas Arc Rise seems to just beat you over the head. Hey, religion's the whole thing. And guess what? Religion affects politics, so you get to deal with all that too. Yay!
Yeah, I think that was also just kind of one of the things I pointed out. Like, there is, unintentionally or not, there's a lot of socio-political commentary in Arc Rise, and I don't think that was the point. If you know anything about Japanese history, like, you're gonna point that out, and you're gonna see that. I think it's a lot, not only safer in 7th Dragon just having this reference, but it's also just a cool thing where you look up Takahaya and, oh wait, that's just an entire story. It's just a slight reference, but it's not copied one for one. There are elements, like when Takahaya bestows the Dragon Slayer a sword to humanity, but it's not copied one to one. Like, he's not giving it to a god. He's giving it just to humans so they can fight off a dragon, and even then it's only a temporary solution for the dragon problem. What are your thoughts on how 7th Dragon paced it, where you have this very short story, which is probably beatable in about 5 to 10 hours, versus Arc Rise Fantasia, which is this very long and, as you said, complex knot of a story that you can easily get lost in if you drop the game for a month?
So this somewhat ties in to the platforms that these were released on, right? 7th Dragon was released on the DS, and the DS had a size limitation on the cartridge, right? I think it's something like a half a gig or something. Whereas the Wii uses DVDs, if I remember right. And I think they're the dual layer kind, so you get like 8 gigs or something, maybe.
Arc Rise did not have that 8 gig capacity. Arc Rise had, I think, the 4 gig capacity, so much smaller. But 7th Dragon, I want to say that's about, it's not like, I want to say it's like 128 megabytes. I could be wrong, and future sheep will point out who's right and who's wrong.
Okay, but still, between the two, you can see there's quite a size difference in terms of what they had available to them for their build. So, Seventh Dragon, they had a more succinct story, and they were doing more with the sprite work and somewhat less with the story, but it fit together nice and cohesively. Whereas with the Wii, you had a lot more space to work with, and I don't think they were utilizing that correctly. They spent a lot more time on the story, clearly, because, well, it's half the game basically if you're just sitting there, but they didn't really work it with what they had. I don't think that makes sense. It makes sense to me somehow, but I don't think I'm explaining myself well.
Yeah, I think I can reframe that. Like, so the thing with Seventh Dragon is that there are the set of story side quests called sub events, and you can basically opt into them. So, for example, if you want to know more about Emile and her past, you can at a certain point just talk to Emile and she'll give you like a hint on what to do for her story. And once you complete it, you get to understand, she came from a different planet called Hypnos. That planet was wiped out, so she carried that hatred with her and went to Tokyon, but that also was so negative that when she was experimenting on Takahaya, she basically estranged herself from Itel, and those two do not see eye to eye. You can sense that in the story, at least on a surface level, but when you go into the sub event, you understand more about why Emile is the way she is. And there are a bunch of sub events that develop all the characters in Seventh Dragon, but you don't even need to know that backstory to understand their purpose in the plot. Whereas in Arc Rise Fantasia, because they have basically a gigantic disk space to play with, they wanted to play with skits that intersperse character development throughout the plot, but it's all just one long, you are sitting down for this entire thing. If you don't like this ride, you cannot get off. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think that's basically the point that I was trying to get to.
And I mean, let's just ask the obvious question, Cheese. Now that you know the story of Seventh Dragon, how did an outsourced company perform that well?
It boils down to they were a younger company back when they did Seventh Dragon. They were not so concerned with business side stuff. So they were managing the outsourced company creatively better than Arc Rise when they had all the people on their team not outsourced and they had to do business decisions in place.
The final question is Arc Rise had its story delayed for 6 months out of a 3-year development cycle. Now that we know the story of Seventh Dragon and now that we know the story of Arc Rise, why do you think Arc Rise got delayed for 6 months?
Well, there's a couple possible reasons in my mind that I have not researched. One is they were developing for the Wii now, which did they do any Wii games before this?
They did Detective Conan, which, in my opinion, doesn't even count as a game.
Okay, so I'm going to chalk it up to pre-production work. They had to do an entirely new engine to make Arc Rise actually work on the Wii, as opposed to Conan, which they probably just got an engine from Nintendo if they provided one, and it was a simpler game to make, whereas Arc Rise was more difficult. So the story got pushed back while they were doing all the pre-production work to actually get something working on the Wii. But also it's possible that they just kept doing rewrites of the story and it was just bad and they could never get to a point where it was good enough. And then they just said, screw it, we're going to go with this and we have to produce a product so that we make money.
That sounds exactly like Sands of Destruction, and that's now a pattern.
Unfortunate.
I think final question before we move, or before we move on to just talking about the review in general. Cheese, there was a cutscene where Rifia was debugging. As a programmer, how do you feel represented in that cutscene?
I feel like Final Fantasy XIV did that boss better, and I think Rifia needs to go touch grass.
You don't like her telling you the code is 000001?
I'll be honest, I zoned out. It was just so bad.
Yeah, like I think, and again, you absolutely did hit the nail on the head, at least in my own speculation. Like they just didn't know what they wanted because Rifia being a coder is like very rarely mentioned ever. They say like, "Oh yeah, this code is infected." Okay, great. What does that mean? Like they throw you mathematical terms like imaginal and real, imaginary number and real number, but it's literally just there because someone opened a textbook and said, "Oh yeah, this is a math number. Let's use it." So
Yeah,
it definitely.
it's very just strange altogether. I'm unsure about a lot of it, and you probably know more of Tales of Symphonia and the such. I'm wondering where they pulled that from, or if it was a creative work that they put in.
That's the thing. When it comes to Tales of Symphonia, they don't really take that much from like mathematical terms. They do have a character Remiel, but that is a biblical name. And for the most part, they create their own world. So this is quite seriously Imageepoch going, I'm going to make my own Tales of Symphonia, but they don't understand how to create that environment like organically, if that makes sense. They'll take inspiration, and if I can be very honest and just poke at myself for a minute, it feels like something that I wrote in high school when I thought I was going to be a novelist. Like, here is this great game. I'm just going to take the game, I'm going to make it my own. I'm going to have a few twists that Squall never did in Final Fantasy VIII. There's my novel.
I see. Then I'm wondering though, if they're not pulling from Tales of Symphonia, what game are they pulling that from? Because it's so very out of place. I don't think the coder thing comes up anywhere else, from what I can tell. The only time it's really mentioned is that boss fight and the fact that real and imaginal are mathy terms and they're robots of some sort. The whole rest of it is very much otherwise like low to mid fantasy.
Yeah, that's all original content. So that is a mystery for the ages.
Well, I'm hoping it's a reference to something because it's so weird.
I genuinely do not know where imaginal and real came from or like how that coder idea came to be.
Maybe once you start tracking the different writers throughout, maybe you'll find one of them that introduced the idea at some point.
Yeah, I guess I have to start researching Kanemaru now. So that's going to be interesting because he legitimately wrote Scarlet Nexus, and I can just play that game again. So that's just the story, and I think we did, beat a dead horse and offered a bit of our speculation, which honestly is just the reason why we have this podcast. But let's just talk about the review and review. I think there were a handful of things that I myself was not confident in, and that was comparing other games in the review. So with Arc Rise Fantasia, I went very, very far in the other direction as opposed to Seventh Dragon and pulled out a lot of hand-picked examples of what a battle system should be for Arc Rise Fantasia, as opposed to Seventh Dragon, where I compared it to its immediate competition. So moving forward, Cheese, what do you think about either style? And what do you think I should be doing moving forward?
I think there's a balance to be struck here. Doing it the Seventh Dragon way certainly works, and more so in terms of just presenting how the battle system actually functions. But in terms of a business space, you want to be comparing it to its competitors. In that case, I think the way you did it here in Arc Rise Fantasia is a little better because it gives you more insight into what the influences are between the different games in the space.
Okay, yeah, and I think I do want to do that moving forward. So I'm a little bit torn with going too far out and comparing games that have just better battle systems than the Imageepoch game that I'm reviewing. Because one, I record all of that footage on my own, and two, that ends up into that whole point that I was making about that comparing games in an Arc Rise Fantasia game just turns into an advertise for everything but Arc Rise Fantasia. But I do need to think like a businessman, and I do need to approach things how Mikage as a CEO would approach things. Because as a CEO, you're in charge of basically, think Imageepoch was about 100 strong with its full-time employees. So you're basically in charge of 120 people in your early to mid 30s. Of course, you're going to make very quick decisions, and you have to think like popular is always going to be better than whatever niche thing we're doing, because we're a niche company and we need to get popular. So, that being said, things like brand name and big developer are king because they will do the advertising for you. That is where the big divide, when we get into Luminous Arc 3, that's where you're going to start seeing it. And when we go into the PSP years, where we have Fate Extra, a game from the Fate Stay Night series, that's where you're definitely going to see this battle between what is an original Imageepoch game, what Imageepoch wants to be, and what Imageepoch has to be. That's really where we are with those comparison of games, and that's something that I think is now like the thing you look for in a fluff poster game review. In terms of just formatting and structure in general, geez, what are your thoughts on what we can improve on, and what do you think we need to do to change to get to that whole 7,777 subscriber count by the end of this series?
The main thing, from what I can tell, if you want to get subscribers and become a YouTube celebrity, TM, you're going to have to just release videos more frequently. That's the main thing it boils down to. In terms of formatting, it's fine. I don't think there's a problem with super long videos now, especially since the algorithm tends to like 10 to 20 minute long videos anyways. Shorter videos don't matter, and that's not the style of the channel anyways. So yeah, just releasing videos more frequently, it'll just slowly increment its way to the top.
Okay, yeah, and considering that we are going to be retiring the podcast, that should hopefully bring my once a year release schedule to at least twice or three times a year. In terms of sound production, I think I do have a understanding of what I sound like consistently now, that I can just take a recording. If I mess up like a whole paragraph, I can just splice it in on another date without it sounding weird, which was a massive problem in Luminous Arc 2. What if we just changed the presentation style? Like, what if I change my favorite neutral microphone, which I'm using now, and switch to an SM7B?
Certainly, you'll have to do some tests on your own. You can run them by me to see if different mic sounds better. I've been using an AT2020 for the past like 10 years. Nobody seems to complain about it. It's fine. I think it picks up a little too much, and I probably would consider a dynamic microphone, like a Shure SM70 or 57 or something, but it's fine. It works. I think that's maybe something to consider. You can do a test or two with it, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and that's what I'm gonna have the Blue Sky for. Like, moving forward, I'm just gonna have me just saying random lines, and having you, whoever is watching and whoever's following me on Blue Sky, like have some input. In terms of structure, I like a very, very structured story, or I like a very, very structured review, because, in my opinion, you are coming to this review after you've played the game, or you have enough of a knowledge to say, okay, what does this guy think? And what does he think of gameplay? So I'm curious, what do you think about nesting the game review itself within the story, as what most YouTubers tend to do now?
It depends on how it's presented within the story. For a longer video where you can sort of chunk it out into chapters like you've been doing, I think it might work better with that sort of way that you've been doing. But again, you can do a test. maybe a short, like 5 minute section of it and see how it works, if it's confusing or not, and go from there.
Right. Because I think the whole trend, and at least what I've seen with the other YouTubers like Marsh, Togane, Magellar, Dungeon Chill, like everybody just tends to talk about things in this one blanket where they start from the story, they introduce mechanics, they do a little bit of review, and then they end the story when they end their review. I think for me, that doesn't work because of how I compare games. But at least in terms of lowest common denominator and trying to grow the channel, that is what is expected. So I think, yeah, you're right. I think I'm going to have to just do random cuts. I'll try to find a way to share it on Blue Sky or something, even though they only have like 1 minute shticks. But I
You can do
do.
private videos, that works too.
Oh, really? Huh.
Well, on YouTube, you put a private video and
Oh, yeah,
post the
yeah.
link to Blue Sky. That works.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But I think things like that I can at least do. I'll probably do like a 5 minute video. There are like a handful of meme videos that I want to do. There is like a remnant from Seventh Dragon about trying to beat the entirety of Seventh Dragon with one medic. So I can definitely use that as a test bed. But yeah, I think things like that is where I'm going to be the testing ground. So just meme videos, not just me drinking fucking Wani wine. Yeah, if nobody knows what Wani wine is, you're gonna want to look into my. No, I didn't post that on the Blue Sky. I posted fucking Elden Lane, but that's another story.
It all started with Gator Wine.
No, it started with fucking Zed did this. He posted fucking Noster, and I
Oh
said yes,
yeah,
chef.
yeah, that's right.
Okay, if none of you know what this is, you're gonna want to go on the Blue Sky, and this is my plug for the Blue Sky. You get to see me just putting liquids into my mouth in like one disgusting combination.
Oh, you don't forget about Cherry Miku.
Cherry Miku, yeah, we had fun with Miku. By God, if I do New Game Plus and go to Japan again, I'm I'm somehow bringing a can of Monster with me, or no, not can of Monster, can of Guinness, or at least finding Guinness, or that fucking Hugarden shit.
Oh yeah, Whole Garden rose beer.
Yeah, but yeah, that's pretty much it. This has been a long goodbye and a long, almost 1.5 hour eulogy for the podcast. This is goodbye. Thank you for sticking around, and thank you, the viewer, for putting up with all the weirdness, all the experimentation. Thank you, Cheese, for coming out here every single time on a goddamn weekday. Yeah, it's time to say goodbye. I'm going to miss it, despite all the weirdness and all of the mumbling and ranting and all of the editing that I have to do for a month and a half to push this out. I think it's time to move on, and I feel stronger for it. I feel like I understand my own identity as a YouTuber, as pretentious as that is, but I think that's important because this story for me is going to get a lot more personal, and that's just because I don't know how to tell this story without substituting my own experiences in the substantial gaps that Imageepoch has in their own story. Because at this point in time, Mikage is as old as myself and Cheese. But the difference is that Mikage now has 5 video games under his belt and almost a dozen more that his company has supported. So we can cry and scream about how this game isn't amazing, but Mikage has basically completed our dream and then some of making video games. Right? I'm hiding in my own little world of the medical world because that is a safe bet. Cheese is doing his thing in programming and is doing amazing. But neither of us are video game developers. We talk about video games, we talk about the reception of his video games, and we certainly prod the corpse of Imageepoch and Mikage LLC, but he will do what we'll probably never do in our entire lifetime. And that is have the balls to make a company and bet everything on a dream that basically failed. So I guess that's it. And if myself trying to graduate from weird YouTuber with a mandatory podcast for every episode to just YouTuber with this game, that's the only thing I can do. And that's the only thing I'm probably capable of doing at this point in my life. Now is the time to not just laugh at Mikage. Now is the time to actually start to understand Mikage as a human being with what he has left behind. Because as far as we're concerned, he's never going to be in the public eye again. So I guess that being said, I want you to stay tuned for Luminous Arc 3, because I'm going to do good on myself, because I do not like Luminous Arc 1 and Luminous Arc 2 in review. I absolutely think that everything up until Stand of Destruction needs to be redone. I'm going to try and challenge myself to release Luminous Arc 3 review on December 10th, 2025. This is the same exact challenge that I spectacularly failed with Luminous Arc 2 almost 2 years ago. Now that I have a very sizable test audience, now that I have a better understanding of what I write, what I want to write, and what I want to make you feel when I write, and most importantly, I'm about 70 to 80% done with the script, and I am set to record at least in a few weeks while I edit this podcast in parallel. Not only that, I have just about every single one of my workflow templates ready to go. So things like all of my plugins, they're just on a macro, ready to go. The basic things that I do in video editing, all ready to go. And a library of sources, images, porn, I'm ready to go. Geez, do you have any final words for the podcast?
I can assure you that this NaNoWriMo, I will finish last year's NaNoWriMo.
Motherfucker, you're not done?
Look, man, I'm not Mikage.
True. But I think that's really it. You know, we're two schmucks that are creative because we now have a nest egg. But Mikage, he bet it all. And you can only feel empathy for that kind of person because honestly, he's probably in his 40s now, and he's probably too afraid to confront what he did in the past and, you know, how everything turned out. But I guarantee you, and I mean, geez, I'm going to speak for you for a second. I think he has lived a life far more exciting than we will ever experience. Doesn't matter if we're going to go on road trips, doesn't matter if we're going to go travel to beautiful places, climb mountains, you know, climb Mount Fuji. I think that within his 10 years of Imageepoch, he will live a life that we'll never live.
So anyways, Sheep, you should go check your coffee.
Fuck you.